I don't know if anybody out there, other than me and a handful of people on Twitter, forced themselves to sit through the New York Times promotional special that aired on FX, in which they melodramatically announced their endorsement. But as mentioned, I did so because, hey, what else am I going to do? And I kept the TV on. I almost never watch FX to my knowledge. I don't know that I've really ever seen it. Maybe there's a show that I've seen on it at times, but I kept the TV on for a little while after the show ended and some Jumanji remake movie came on. And I almost think that I would have been better served just watching that Jumanji movie, even though it looked pretty terrible. I remember watching the original Jumanji as a kid and don't even recall being aware that they did a remake of it. But that appeared on the TV. What they say in this New York Times endorsement to conclude it at the very end is, "May the best woman win." Hmm. That's kind of a tell because it would almost seem to violate some metaphysical code for the New York Times to endorse an old white guy at this juncture. So I don't think they ever even entertain the possibility of endorsing Bernie or endorsing Biden because that just would so totally contravene their precious liberal sensibilities and would be regarded by the members of that editorial board as intolerable. Now, I recognize the absurdity of my even discussing the New York Times editorial board endorsement because who cares? And to the extent that anybody cares, it's not because that they really think this could have any impact at all on voting behavior. It's because they're interested in analyzing what it says about the predilections of the New York Times. And the New York Times is extremely influential for better or worse. Still, to this day, sets the news agenda very often. One New York Times op ed column can throw the entire political media narrative into upheaval. So you do have to sort of keep tabs on what they're up to if you're a discerning consumer of news. For example, the New York Times treatment of Tulsi was very indicative going back months. The few times that they profiled her, or the one profile that they did of her that she participated in the summer, basically portrayed her as a doomsayer. I believe the actual title was Tulsi Gabbard Thinks We're All Doomed. And that article was a total joke. It was written by the romantic partner of one Barry Weiss. And do we remember how Barry Weiss beclowned herself early on in this campaign by appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast and saying, "Oh my God, isn't she the best friend of Assad?" So that's the sentiment that the New York Times reflected in their coverage of Tulsi. Notably, Tulsi declined to participate at all in this charade, which seems perfectly reasonable to me. She was asked and turned down the New York Times offer to participate, which is a bit of a power move, I would say, um, because ultimately the endorsement was going to be a foregone conclusion. Foregone conclusion in the sense that whoever they chose to endorse would be the perfect emblem of this kind of myopic, overly performative, hollow, and indecisive American liberalism, of which the New York Times has always been the foremost standard bearer. But the indecisive point was really hammered home because what they chose to do was endorse both Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, Amy and Liz, because, or so they proclaim at the end of their endorsement, let the best woman win. So it's got to be a woman in their eyes. So the point of this dual endorsement apparently was because they wanted to give what they perceived to be the best choice from these dueling camps, so to say, in the Democratic primary. One is the hard charging reformer camp focused on structural change and really revamping the system as it exists. And the other camp are the more moderate types who maybe want some reform, but in general, really prioritize just reestablishing what they would regard as credibility in the Oval Office. Now, I always thought that these so called camps were extremely reductive characterizations of the dynamics at play in the race, but that really is the comically oversimplified frame through which entities like the New York Times tend to view these questions. So to them, Warren is the best personification of the hard charging structural change camp, and Amy is the best personification of the more moderate, let's take it easy, let's all get along camp. Bernie, according to them, is too divisive. And we can't replace one divider, Trump, with another divider, Bernie. That's more or less what they assert in the text of the endorsement. I interrupt my train of thought because I just saw a comment in the live chat. Somebody says, "You interviewed me at a Bernie Rob Quist rally in Billings, Montana in 2017. Do I remember? Do I remember? I remember being at those rallies. I can't say that I remember you in particular because you're just behind a username, but I would believe you if you say that I interviewed you there because I definitely did attend those. That was an interesting campaign to cover. That was with the Young Turks. So yes, hello. But there goes my train of thought. Somebody says, "How many whiskeys tonight, Mike? I need a few." LOL. 0 for me tonight. I maybe should have helped myself to some prior to watching that New York Times special on FX, which was so stupid. And I think more power to Tulsi for sitting that one out. Another conscious abstention on Tulsi's part. You have the present vote, and you have the declination to participate in such a ridiculous spectacle. What the New York Times really did here was they claimed it was under the auspices of making their endorsement process more transparent, which it was to some extent, but of course they're not going to reveal the real deliberations that went into the final endorsement decision. They just showed like 12-second clips of them all writing down names on a piece of paper, and it's all very much choreographed and highly produced. So transparency, they're kind of giving a veneer of transparency to make it more compelling and force people to tune in. They had a rollout that lasted, I don't know, approximately a week, and it was also, you would be compelled to sit in front of the TV on Sunday night at 10 o'clock and watch FX, where they had this endorsement special. And, no, to their credit, it did work to some extent because I sat there and watched it. So I'm not going to deny that it had some effectiveness. Somebody says you'd be an awesome guest on the Joe Rogan show. Hey, always would be happy to do it. Obviously, um, yeah, just let whoever is in charge there know, and I do it in a second. Clearly, um, yeah. So the New York Times had this reality show spectacle, and the Bernie interview was interesting because if you look at how they edited it, there were times when Bernie would make a comment, and they would pan over to one of the editorial board members sitting there, who's like, eyes are bulging or who has some kind of dismissive facial expression. And one of the editors, when they were asked to sort of lay out the pros and cons of Bernie, one of the editors, Lauren Kelly, who actually I've dealt with in years past on various things, um, she says, a lot of what Bernie says is very vague. She likes Warren because she's a fighter. So she's the type of person who would be super impressed by Warren's touting of plans because it appeals to the wonkish sensibility of the American elite liberal class. They want to know that there are plans that are very carefully phrased, as if those plans will have any bearing on governance later on. They will not. The plans are always subsumed into the chaos of governance, whether through the legislative process, through the rough and tumble of drafting executive actions, through other political eventualities that disrupt this idea that you can just seamlessly implement whatever plans that you lay out in a campaign. The point of those plans is to signal to a certain set of voters that Warren is in touch with your desire for expertise and your desire for, again, kind of performatively wonky competence. Much more reliable of a barometer to judge candidates, I've always thought, and this has really been crystallized by following Bernie for the past 5 years now. Much more salient, I think, is to just have some core themes. And yeah, you can have a plan, I guess, but it's much better to have some bedrock themes that you can articulate in a coherent way, in a digestible way to the populace, and then give them confidence that you will, once in office, act on those themes by translating them into plans later on. Plans at this stage are virtually worthless except for acting as a signaling device to certain elite influencers that you want to win over to your cause. And in the case of Warren, it worked. She got the endorsement. Now it's a half endorsement, which is ridiculous. But it did work to some extent. So one recommendation I had for Liz was, yo, Liz, make sure that you tonight, right now, do it. Revamp all your campaign signage, all your literature, all your TV advertisements, all your leaflets, etc. in Iowa, and make sure it says with big, bold, maybe bright red lettering that you were half endorsed by the New York Times. I think that would go over really well in Iowa. I think you'd see a groundswell of support from Iowa caucus goers who are all going to rush out their doors on a cold February evening to caucus for you because you have been given the imprimatur of the New York Times. Actually, half the imprimatur. They are just going to love that. That's going to really get them out there for you. So try that out. um, so did anybody actually? I'm trying to see. Did anybody the uh, in the chat actually watch this thing? I doubt it. Again, it's not a matter of watching it because you think that voters are going to change their behavior as a result of this endorsement. Any voters who might change their behavior as a result of this endorsement are confined to like one square block on the Upper East Side. So there might be like 3 people total in the entire country. Um, but it's about understanding what the New York Times represents politically and ideologically. So that's why I watch it. Not because I think anybody out there in Iowa, New Hampshire, or any place else is going to say, I'm going to obey the New York Times and vote accordingly. And even if like you did construct a hypothetical voter who would obey the New York Times endorsement dictate, what are they even supposed to do? You dual endorsed. I thought the whole point of endorsement was to make a choice. The New York Times kind of promoted this whole farce as the choice. And they didn't even make a choice. They made like a heavily qualified and incoherent choice. Now, I saw some people saying that the incoherence of this choice is underscored by the fact that they chose Warren and Klobuchar because they're perceived to be diametrically opposite to one another on an ideological spectrum. Well, maybe that's not exactly the case. Maybe the New York Times being comfortable with both Warren and Klobuchar indicates that Warren and Klobuchar are not so far apart ultimately. They just check certain boxes that are within the New York Times comfort zone. And if they have that ability, that tells you something about the fundamental similarity between Warren and Klobuchar. So I say it's incoherent because it's just intrinsically incoherent to endorse two candidates when it's a zero sum choice that you make when you're voting. Although, arguably, in the case of Iowa, it's a little different because in a caucus, your second choice could become relevant if your first choice doesn't meet a threshold at a given caucus site. So in Iowa, if a candidate doesn't get 15% in a caucus site, then they're eliminated, and you have to choose another candidate. So that's the idiosyncrasies of the caucus. So I guess theoretically it could become relevant in that context, but And on a more basic level, it just doesn't make sense to be endorsing two candidates. Um, I think really what they were doing is just signaling that they think it's necessary to nominate a woman. So if you're on the moderate camp or the structural reform camp, what the New York Times is saying is that a woman must be the representative of either camp. Um, and again, it was interesting. So given that, it's interesting to me how Tulsi is just 100% ignored in the endorsement. Granted, she didn't participate, but there are numerous candidates who did not participate who were mentioned in the endorsement. They brought up Steve Bullock and Michael Bennett. It's just like, what? Is anybody closely following the Michael Bennett campaign right now? I actually have seen some ads for him in New Hampshire. But and then Steve Bullock, he's been out of the race for over a month and made very little impact while he was in it. And whatever you think of Tulsi, she's raised critical issues over the course of the campaign and actually had probably a bigger impact than people might have supposed. I mean, she essentially destroyed Kamala Harris, which Kamala Harris's own campaign personnel admitted in like the post campaign autopsy that was published in the New York Times. So just to ignore, to say on the one hand that basically what we're endorsing is a woman, and then to ignore one of the women who's made a significant impact on the race gives you an insight into the fundamental superficiality of the New York Times and the way in which, again, they embody this sort of hollow, ineffectual liberalism. Uh, one thing that I noticed in watching the special was that the New York Times hung apparently a portrait or has a portrait of Angela Merkel hanging in their boardroom where they sit there and make these decisions. So there's got to be some symbolism there that I don't really feel like fully unpacking right now, but that jumped out at me. Okay, on non, and then also in this in one of the clips of Biden that they showed, um, they're basically asking him about his physical and mental competence stemming from his age-related decline. Right, and every time Biden is asked about this, he does some kind of stupid stuff. Like he challenges somebody to a push-up contest. He says, run a mile with me. He says something to that effect. And in this New York Times interview, he said, just watch me. Come and spend 16 hours a day with me campaigning or whatever. I'm just like, we have watched you, Joe. And you've reached a point where if you're able to string together a coherent set of thoughts without, you know, fumbling in embarrassing fashion or having some sort of obvious cognitive hiccup, it's regarded as a great performance by you. So we have watched you and we've noticed that you are unable to formulate coherent sentences. Somebody says, hasn't Biden said that his would be a one-term presidency, or did I imagine that? Doesn't that kind of lend credence to the whole age thing with him? There were reports that were anonymously sourced as usual, which said that Biden was entertaining the notion of announcing that he was only going to seek one term. But he's denied that, and he actually denied it in the New York Times editorial board interview that he did. Um, so, but nonetheless, were Biden to get the nomination, his vice presidential choice would be more significant than usual, just by dint of his age, because automatically that person would become the Democratic Party's successor, essentially. And ironically, when Obama picked Biden in 2008, one of the rationales behind it, to the as I recall, was that it was like, okay, good. So we're sort of leaving the Democratic Party open to new successors because obviously Biden's way too old to run himself after Obama leaves office. So Biden would have been what, 65 at the time, and it was just assumed, oh yeah, I mean that's clearly too old for him to run again later on. And sure enough, he's right. He's in the lead, depending on how you quantify it exactly, but at least in contention for sure. Um, what else was I going to say? Now I lost my train of thought. I'm pulling a Biden. I didn't lose my train of thought. I knew I had a point to make, and I lost it. That's what you get for your money with me. High production values and high quality content always. Always. Boop 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 boop. That's okay. Wasn't that great probably anyway. On non New York Times endorsement news, um, I think I mentioned this on a previous live stream, but it cut off because of the shoddy hotel internet. Um, at the Tulsi event that I was at on, what was it, Friday? Yeah, Friday. She made a statement that I hadn't heard her articulate uh, before in quite that manner about drug policy. So she was asked by somebody who asked a very intelligent question, I thought. Um, would your vision to for remedying the ills of drug prohibition involve just funding more addiction centers and treatment centers and that sort of thing, or would it involve upending the paradigm of the drug prohibition overall by legalizing and regulating drugs? And she said she would support legalizing and regulating all illicit drugs, which is further than I had heard her go on that subject before. Um, and to my mind, I'm sorry, it's got a funny text. Um, to my mind, it's very positive because it again highlights how she's always thinking about structural issues, and you can't change issues caused by drug prohibition without reassessing the very premises that underlie the entire drug prohibition regimen itself. Um, and of course, the knee jerk response is, oh, what? So we're going to have every 7-Eleven selling heroin now? No. The point is to extricate drug policy from the law enforcement arena and put it into a regulated legal framework where you're ending prohibition, but you're not simply creating a total free for all where people are permitted to hand out heroin on every street corner, right? So that's a straw man. Um, regulated is the emphasis there. Certain prescription drugs are legal, right? But it's illegal to possess them in certain circumstances. I'm not saying that we would want the same model that applies to prescription drugs to apply to all currently illegal drugs, but just to emphasize that in theory, a legal market doesn't mean an entirely unfettered market. So the model that she brings up and invokes as something worthy of replicating, or at least incorporating into the US context, is the Portugal model. Glenn Greenwald did one of the first comprehensive studies on the Portugal decriminalization model, where all drugs are legal to possess in Portugal now since 2001. And it's been a rousing success. Everybody pretty much who studied it has concluded that it's reduced rates of addiction, reduced the sort of ancillary harms associated with uh, drugs, illicit drugs, and it's just overall a far better method for treating the problem. If you can look at what's gone on in the US in the past 7 or 8 years with regard to opioids and heroin, then I think you're kind of crazy if you endorse maintaining the status quo. So while saying legalize drugs to some may come across as extreme, and actually the person who asked the question to Tulsi phrased it as, would you be willing to endorse a more extreme approach? And she was somehow saying, I don't think that's extreme at all. She essentially said what's extreme is maintaining the untenable status quo that breeds so much harm. And I think that's inarguable. So I took note of that response, and one of the top drug reform advocates in the country, guy named Tom Angel, contacted me because this is something that he covers for a living, essentially. And I sent him, the audio clip of her giving this response, and he wrote it up at Forbes, and it went out today. So look that up if you see fit. As usual, I've pretty much every Tulsi event I go to, I meet somebody who um, who watches this stream or follows me on Twitter or has read my articles and whatnot. So it's always good to meet you people who are very friendly. Um, and seeing the super chat once again interrupts my train of thought. I have to probably figure out a better way to demarcate my speech and thinking so that I'm not constantly getting lost in the live chat feed. But somebody says, do you believe in love after love? I can feel something inside me saying, I really don't think you're strong enough. So, do you believe in life after love? Fave novel. The novel that I really liked that I read relatively recently, and which isn't a new novel, but I hadn't read until again relatively recently, was a Confederacy of Dunces. I love that book. Um, I don't know if people are familiar with it, but it's basically centers on this bizarre character, Ignatius J. Riley, who fumbles around New Orleans, interacting with people and getting into unnecessary conflicts. So read that. novel if you haven't. I thought it was really good. And I'm not a huge fiction person, but every once in a while, just to mix things up, I will kind of force myself to read a novel just because I like its useful for sort of broadening your imaginative horizons. And I should probably do more of it. Somebody says, I look a little bit like John Kennedy Toole, who is the author of Confederacy of Dunces. Do I? Let me look him up real quick. I know I've seen his picture before. He has no beard. So that automatically disqualifies that comparison. Maybe I'll have to shave, and then you can evaluate whether I do in fact look like him. Amy says, thanks for watching and reading the NYTBS so I don't have to. You're welcome. That's what I do. I do the annoying stuff that relates to American politics that you don't have to do. Like I read the Mueller report for you people, and I still haven't gotten enough thanks for that. I read the Horowitz IG report for you people. I read what else? I read the impeachment Judiciary Committee report for you people. I read this, read this junk because, frankly, in all honesty, I would read it anyway. That's just the type of very bizarre person that I am. But I try, I guess, to channel that bizarre obsessive quality that I possess into something that's informative for my wider audience because I know that you people would probably rather watch football or I don't know, take a walk in the park or um what are some other things that normal people do? They like go skiing and stuff. Um but I don't really do any of that. Although I did actually go to the movies earlier today for the first time in a while, and I saw 1917, which I thought was really good. Um, just in terms of its cinematography, I thought the acting on the part of the two main characters was very good. Um, maybe it's just me, but I couldn't quite hear all the dialogue clearly. It might have been just been the theater I was at. So I heard probably about I would say 65% of the dialogue, but it's not wasn't a hugely dialogue heavy movie. Um, but yeah, it was good. I would recommend it. Um, oh, another thing I do for you people that again is a product of my own highly idiosyncratic personality traits is I fight people on Twitter for you. So I am leading the charge on your behalf against all the morons on Twitter. So I hope you appreciate that. Somebody says once you go M Tracy, you never go back. I'm gonna hope there is no sexual connotation there, and even if there is a sexual connotation, I'm fine with it. Somebody says, "Sing the Buddha Jazz song." Is that the High Hypes Hope song? Gotta have high hopes for a living. Da 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 do da ba do ba da ba do ba da ba da ba da high hopes. I would never learn the full lyrics of that song because it's just too mind-bendingly irritating. My brain sort of shuts off when the first note of that song plays, and I just have to run out of the room. I guess mostly at this point because of the connotations or the association it has with Mayor Pete. And as I said on a previous stream, um, at Tulsi's event, the same event actually where she made the statement on drug policy, there was a girls' basketball game happening right down the hall because it was in a high school, and at halftime, I guess there was some kind of dance performance, and it was the soundtrack was the High High Hopes for a Living song, and you could hear the song sort of bleeding into the room where Tulsi was in. So I was like, wow, is Mayor Pete gonna bust into the room in like a surprise WWE style entrance, like when the glass breaks for Stone Cold and he runs in? There's the guy asking in the chat about Amy Therese being banned from Twitter. Yeah, I'm Team Amy. She's a little bit too. I like her. She makes some good points. Sometimes she could be a little crazy, but then again, so can I. Crazily online is how I would describe Amy. I'm no slouch when it comes to throwing bombs on Twitter in particular, but she takes it to a whole nother level. And she was banned for probably the dumbest reason ever, which is apparently what she says is that Warren needs to be beaten, by which she meant beaten electorally. And I guess that was construed by the geniuses at the Twitter moderation squad as a physical threat, a threat of physical violence, which is like self evidently stupid. Somebody asked, "What's your Attitude Era WWF intro music song, Michael?" Hmm. I guess it would have to be the Val Venus song. Hello, ladies. And the saxophone solo. I had. Does anybody remember this? If you were obsessed with the WWF, as it was then called, like I was as an adolescent, there was. They put out like a soundtrack of, I think it was like hip hop versions of the songs, of the intro songs. I had that CD. So there was like a Degeneration X song, and I don't even remember, but I know I had that song. I know I had that album or that CD. It was like maybe it was just Attitude or something. I don't know. One of my favorite songs now that I'm thinking about it was the D'Lo Brown song. Remember that? It was like, "You're looking at the real deal now," something like that. WWF Aggression. Yeah, I think that's what it was called. Now I'm gonna look it up. Yeah, WWF Aggression is a soundtrack album by WWE. It features entrance music of wrestlers re-recorded by various hip hop artists and groups. I was right. Released on March 21st, 2000. I had that CD for sure. I remember the big Christmas present I asked for one year was the um, autobiography of Mick Foley, signed. There was like a package you could get from the WWF store where it was the Mick Foley signed book and a Mankind T-shirt. And I got that one year, and I read the book. I guess it had to have been 11. It was a long book, if I'm remembering correctly. I want to say it was called Blood, Tears, and Sweat Socks, something like that. Foley is God. No, I don't. It wasn't that one. Hold on. Okay, hold on. Now we've gotten into a WWF tangent, so good job, people. Yeah, it was Have a Nice Day, A Tale of Blood and Sweat Socks. Released December 1998. Oh no, it released October 1999. So that year for Christmas, I got that. Somebody says, please make a video singing to raise funds. Should I just do a full singing live stream where you guys give me song requests? Maybe I shouldn't reveal this, but I actually was in an a cappella group at one point. Dear God, I hope those videos are not anywhere on the internet. But actually, it was pretty good. Um, Sing Lust for Life, someone says. I loved that album at the time. MGMT, right? Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. Lust for Life is Lana Del Rey. What am I thinking? There's similarly named MGMT. Uh, wasn't there? Okay, got confused. But yeah, I could sing some full Lana Del Rey songs. I think my favorite album of hers is Ultra Violence. You guys know that one? Yeah, she's somebody who I stan. I did the full music stream. I think I would probably want some instrumental accompaniment just in case I get hellishly off tune, which is a distinct possibility. Out on the West Coast, they got a saying: if you're not drinking, then you're not playing. But you got the music, you got the music in you, don't you? That's your Lana Del Rey interlude. How could you not like Lana Del Rey? I don't trust you. I like. I always surprise people when I tell them that I like a wide variety of female vocalists. So there aren't like a lot of like male singer songwriters that I tend to like. I guess I could probably name a few, but I like a bunch of females: Lana Del Rey, Carly Rae Jepsen. I like Lord. I'm not gonna pretend that my musical taste is super sophisticated. There was a time when I was in my teens and early to mid 20s when I was much more invested in the musical scene, getting the latest releases and such. And now I just don't have as much patience for it, but I still do like, um, a bunch of artists. I still like Lady Gaga, whose vocal chops are unmatched, I think. Um, Janelle Monet, always liked. MIA. Billie Eilish was cool. I actually thought her album was really good. Um, but I guess at a certain stage in life, at least for me, you move past making your musical preferences at all central to your identity, which is kind of like what I can recall doing as a teenager and younger adult. That's what he says. Yeah, and Cat Power I used to like. Um, Somebody mentioned Snoop Dogg. Yeah, who doesn't like Snoop Dogg? I used to. Uh, there, there are some. Let's just say there's one Snoop Dogg song in particular that I know all the words of, and I'm not going to name it because it might get me in trouble. Um, all right, people, this has gone down a weird road. So it's 1:18 a.m. and I guess you'd expect things to get a little weird at this point in the evening. So I'm gonna leave it there for now, and we'll do it again probably tomorrow. Sure, something new will come up. So good night, good luck, rest easy, sweet dreams. Blah 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 blah.